Hello AP Econ students. Today's flip video is about free trade and restrictions on trade. If you need a refresher on why trade is beneficial, please go back and watch flip video 1. So in class, we will discuss scenarios where trade is restricted, as well as situations where free trade exists between nations. So free trade exists from countries and international bodies, sometimes with the facilitating help of the World Trade Organization, when they decided trade agreements or the rules and guidelines for unrestricted trade. So what might motivate countries to create these agreements? In addition to the positive benefits of trade that we discussed in last video, there also is the potential for political and diplomatic ties with trade partners. So even with the positive political incentives and the positive economic incentives of trade, some nations believe and trust in protectionist or protectionism policies. And so this is when governments restrict or limit trade and are often doing this to protect their citizens or their domestic production or their domestic industries. So illustrated in this comic to the right, we see a fear that uninhibited free trade could possibly lead to domestic poverty instead of using protectionist policies that would create economic stability in that domestic nation. And so trade restrictions, this could occur or be used because of these fears and ideas of national security shown in this comic. But trade restrictions could also be used when a country has a new or young industry that isn't ready to compete with international brands at international prices. And it could also be a country retaliating for another country dumping or taking their items and selling them at much lower international prices, which then saturates the industry or saturates the market with this specific item. So now we're going to look at what tariffs are specifically and how they would look like on a graph. So tariff is a specific tax applied to an imported good. It's a percentage or per unit tax. And so the impact of a tariff means that domestically, consumers have to buy at a higher price. And so we're going to see in a second consumer surplus would decrease, producer surplus would increase. There'd now become deadweight loss, and the government would get a portion of that tariff as tax revenue. So let's look at, currently we have a graph if the market and the domestic producers and consumers are operating under this world price, that there is free trade, there's no tariffs. Currently the consumers are definitely getting the larger benefit of this world price. They have a large consumer surplus. This is their willingness to pay, and they are paying all the way down here. But the producers at this lower price, they only want to supply this quantity of their item, and so their price is very close to their willingness to sell, and they have a small producer surplus. If the country increases the price through a tariff, so now domestically those consumers have to pay more for imports, and the domestic industries are now able to charge at a higher price, the consumer surplus we're going to see decrease, the producer surplus is going to increase, and then per each of those imports, which the reason why we see an import occurring is because there's a shortage of quantity supplied and quantity demanded, that more people are demanding this item than is actually being supplied domestically. This is the quantity of imports that will occur, and on each of those imports there is this specific tax, this specific tariff. So the government is taking in this much money, but each red triangle represents the deadweight loss occurring from the decrease in economic activity. So now that we're looking at quotas, quotas are very similar to tariffs. The only large difference is that on this graph, what used to look like, or used to represent tax revenue, is now representing the amount of the quota. And the quota that is now occurring to fill in that shortage of the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. That again, if we did not have a quota, that any amount of imports were allowed to come in at this lower world price, that the import quantity would be all the way from QD1 QW. But then if the nation, like the US did with quotas on immigration, if the country said, no, we're only allowing a quantity of QD2 to QQ, so let's say we are only allowing 1,000 imports of this item, then instead of the domestic consumers being able to fill in this whole shortage, that only this quantity of items will be able to be purchased internationally by those domestic consumers. And so there's a smaller amount of those imports, and we also have an increase in price from that quota. So thank you all for watching today's video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.